Okay. Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. To start off, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Shezwe, local leader for our Johannesburg chapter for the Interaction Design Foundation. You can always reach out to me if you'd like to be a speaker or would like to recommend a particular topic. Please bear in mind for our event etiquette or the rules for this evening. Let's stop using the chats as we go forward. On Zoom, some of our members are using screen readers, which messes up the conversation or messes up the experience for them. The meeting, any links that you would like to send or any questions that you have, you can put in the chat to send to me directly. And we can address them at the end of the session. Because we are having our South African Sign Language interpreters joining us this evening, I'd like to ask all of you to please speak a little bit slower if you do need to speak, if you would like to say anything. The interpretation will be in South African English, and the interpreters can sign very fast, but because of internet connections not being always reliable, fast signing can result in problems with the connection issues. So please try to speak at an even or slightly slower pace. When you do speak, please try to identify yourself before speaking, just so that we can help some of our members who are visually impaired. The audio, your microphone, please keep your microphone off, as it does disrupt the session and makes it difficult for the speakers, makes it difficult for everyone listening to the speaker. As you can see, we have pinned our sign language interpreter and our guest speaker to the screen. So please, can you keep your camera off unless you'd like to speak. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you are comfortable, then you can put on your camera and and speak. Okay, so let's give you some background on the interaction. Oh, sorry. If you are not familiar with the South African Sign Language, Sign Language, you can see at the bottom of Zoom there is a button for live transcripts. I can't see it on mine at the moment, but it looks like this, where you'll be able to read the captions if sign language is a South African Sign Language is not familiar to you. Just a bit of background about the Interaction Design Foundation. If this is your first time joining us, the IDF was established in Denmark in 2002. It's a movement to create accessible and affordable Ivy League level design education. It was inspired by the Scandinavian educational system to create high quality education for everybody to be able to learn design. Okay, so I'd like to hand it over to our guest speaker this evening. We have Colette, who is internationally certified, and sorry, let me just quickly stop sharing, sorry. She has expertise in universal access, which has led her to being among the first of international applicants to receive the highest echelon of accreditation, which is level 3 advanced accessibility consultant for the international certification of professionals in accessible built environments, which is the CABE program, and has subsequently was invited to be a member of the expert panel along with international experts in universal access. She also serves as part of the groups for the SABS, the South African Bureau of Standards, and also is a guest lecturer on universal access at the University of Cape Town. This is just some of her background, but there's so much more, and you can read more about it on our event invite. So I'd like to hand it over to you, Colette.
Thank you so much, Shezwe. So, like Shezwe has mentioned, my name is Colette Fransolet. For those who are non-visual, I have dark features, I'm Caucasian, I'm wearing black, and this evening I'm sitting in my office, which has got some shelves behind me and some plants. I'm a big plant lover. The interpreter is also wearing a black top, and she's sitting in front of a green screen to make it easier to see her interpretations. So together, I'm going to take you through an introduction of universal design. And we're going to start off with, so where does universal design come from? So a little bit about the origins. It's important to understand that when we start off. Then I'm going to speak a little bit about what universal design actually is. Then we're going to touch on the principles of universal design. And then finally, if there's time, we're going to touch on terminology. I do know that 30 minutes is not a lot of time. I can speak on this for days. So we're going to get through what we can in about 30 minutes. So let's see how we go. So the definition of universal design was defined by a gentleman by the name of Ron Mace, who worked as an architect in America. And so the whole concept really had evolved after the Second World War, when a lot of veterans were wanting to go home after being injured in the war and serving their, their time in service of the military, and wanted to be integrated back into life. And so the change in the requirements of what people needed from the community had developed. And so over time, this had slightly changed. So when they first got home from war in America, it was around about 1945. And the terminology we used then was called barrier-free design. So then it was really about removing obstacles. So along with the 60s and kind of towards the 80s in America, there were a lot of social movements. So movements around empowerment of women, around cultures, around race. So along with that came this movement around access for people with disabilities. And so they kind of joined those social movements. So from around about the mid-80s, it started moving towards universal design and universal access. So universal design really was a concept that was developed in order to integrate people more holistically into society. So on the screen is an image of a pyramid of users. Right at the bottom of the pyramid is what is considered the majority of users. So these are people who are agile, very mobile, and move around very independently. As you make your way up the pyramid, towards the middle, we start seeing users who have different requirements from environment, services, products, and spaces in general. These are the people who are potentially moving furniture. We've got some cleaning staff. We've got people with temporary impairments, so a broken arm, a broken leg. We've got some elderly people and people with young children in this. So the requirements of those users are really starting to change the higher we go up the pyramid. Once you look at the top of the pyramid, you'll see a user who is sitting in a wheelchair who requires 2 assistants to perform their daily tasks or daily functions. So the principle of universal design essentially says the higher up this pyramid we design, the more users we can accommodate. So if we only ever design for the people at the bottom of the pyramid, we will never accommodate users at the top. But if we design from the top down, we're able to accommodate a broad range of users, and a whole range of other prospective users would benefit from good design. So the term universal design was coined by Ron Mace, who was an architect who I mentioned, and he coined the term in 1985. And he defined it as the design of products, services, and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for personal adaptation or special provision. So the whole concept of universal design says, let's allow the greatest extent of users to use the same platform, service, or environment, and not give anyone exceptional or specialized or separated treatment. So Ron Mace practiced as an architect, and in fact, when he started working on the concept of universal design, he was kicked out of the architectural fraternity because the architects weren't so happy to have someone designing for anyone who wasn't what they considered the perfect human at the time. And so he lost his architectural practice kind of status, but continued to work as a specialist in this field. So he himself was also a wheelchair user, which is very interesting. So the whole paradigm of universal design really is about designing for more than just the average user. So universal design, we saw the term coined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So South Africa signed that. Okay, so the convention was ratified in New York in 2006. When it was opened up for signing, South Africa signed immediately. So South Africa signed this convention in 2007 and effectively had declared that we would do, as South Africans, we would do whatever we needed to do to fulfill the rights of people with disabilities in our country. And so it's been a really long journey, but we are finally starting to get somewhere. But the term and the definition of universal design was first written in legislation in this piece of work. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was the first time we saw this definition appear legally in any documentation. And the definition is very similar to the initial definition that we'd seen from Ron Mace. So the actual concept hadn't evolved much. It was just the definition was finally legalized in 2006. So the concept of universal design cannot exclude the use of assistive devices. And so I think often people think of assistive devices as, you know, just a regular wheelchair or something that is very obvious and associated with physical access. But in fact, assistive devices includes things like spectacles. It includes things like hearing aids. It includes all sorts of other aspects associated with hearing impairments, such as cochlear implants. It also includes things like white canes, of which there's actually a whole variety of white canes and white cane users. And it also includes any other form of mobility aids. And so the term universal design in the United Nations Convention had also stated that it shall not exclude the use of assistive devices for particular groups of persons where this is needed. So it includes all groups of people with disabilities as well as people who are using any form of assistive devices. So you can see that there's a broad range of users already that benefit from this concept, and not just a small group of people who are classified as people with disabilities. So what is universal design really about? So we're looking for, it's always about attention to detail. It's the small things that make a big difference. So the first attention to detail is really around function. What is the function that we're wanting any of our services, products, facilities to be performing? So on the screen is a photo of signage. And there's two types of signage. The first sign is purple with an arrow that says reception. The second sign is orange with white text, and it's got three icons on it. And so what is interesting about this signage is that if you were a person with vision, so if you didn't have any sight impairments, this signage would read perfectly fine. But should you be a person who uses Braille, the signage contains Braille. So this is something that performs a function for a group of people who need it, and those who don't need it, it would never obstruct any of their information. So by making a small change in the function of the signage, we're able to accommodate a broader range of users. So another example of function. So I am predominantly right-handed, but I eat left-handed. And so using a fish knife in the left hand is actually really difficult because of the shape of the knife. So on the screen is an image of a set of cutlery that I found at a restaurant, where the fish knife is actually, you can use either side of the fish knife. So it doesn't matter if you're left or right-handed, the function is the same. And so it's attention to detail, but the function is there. So the function allows anyone to use this utensil in the way that they need to. So if you didn't need to use the knife in your left hand, this would never be something that would occur to you. So it's about the attention to detail and how we allow function for different users to use the same equipment, facilities, or services. Also on attention to detail is really around aesthetics. So one of the questions I get a lot, I'll just wait for Pete to arrive. Yay, hi Pete.
And
okay,
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't thank our sign language interpreters or introduce them. I'm so sorry about that.
Perfect. So another attention to detail is really around aesthetics. So one of the questions or one of the problems I get posed with a lot is that designing to accommodate people with disabilities is ugly. Problem with that is because it's always an afterthought. If we design everything into a system from the beginning, whether it's a building or a website or an app, if we design it from the beginning to be inclusive of people with disabilities, the aesthetics is no longer a problem. It only becomes a problem later on if it's added in afterwards. So on the screen is a photo of a Panado box, so pain medication, which only recently in South Africa, probably the last couple of years, had started having Braille on it. And so aesthetically, this doesn't make any difference to anyone who's sighted. But for people with visual impairments, all of a sudden, they have a level of independence that has previously not been afforded to them. So a small change all of a sudden allows people with visual impairments to take medication independently without having to ask anyone for assistance on what box they have or what the packaging is for. So a small change, it's about attention to detail. The aesthetics and the print of the packaging is not affected, but it does allow a newfound freedom for a group of users that previously weren't considered. So next on the screen is toilet flush controls. So I have a fetish for toilets because they are always designed so badly. And so the toilet flush control that's on the screen has got 2 push buttons. But what's nice about these buttons is that they're really big. So they're big and round, and it's very easy to push them. Just makes it so much easier for everybody else. And it looks aesthetically pleasing. So it still looks good, and the function is still there. And it also accommodates a broad range of users. So the last piece around attention to detail in universal access is around integration. So the image on the screen at the moment is a regular park bench, but what is different to this one is that the tabletop is extended past the seating on both left and right sides of the table. This allows a wheelchair user to come in at the picnic table without struggling for space and approach, or struggling to sit at the same table, or having to sit side on facing the other direction. So it's a small change, it's attention to detail, and those who don't need it would never have noticed. But for somebody who does require accessibility, all of a sudden, this is a way of integrating into the same environment. So the last one is a photo of the inside of a plane. And so what you see on the screen is the kind of the bottom side of a seat where somebody's sitting in the seat on the plane. And so I'm quite short. Well, I'm probably just average, but so I'm like 1.6 meters, making it very difficult to reach the cabin luggage that's based at the top of the plane. If you don't need to reach the top cabin, then height is not a problem. If you are slightly shorter and you need to reach your luggage, you have to stand on the seat. What you see in this image is there's a small step. There's a little, almost like a little ladder bolted in at the bottom of the seat so that if you need to reach something at the top and you're too short, you can step on that instead of the seat where somebody's sitting. So it's a small change, it's a attention to detail, but all of a sudden, different users can use the same environment, the same setting in the same way and feel integrated without making a fuss around anyone else who's using the same environment. And so universal access really is about the reality of people. So on the screen is an image of an elderly person. So in reality, we really have an increasing older population. Next on the screen is somebody who's using crutches and big glass panels with visual markings on them in a construction site. And so we have an increase of people who are undergoing medical procedures. We have an increase in development in the construction industries. We have broad range of users who are benefiting from good design, even though they are not technically classified as people with disabilities. Next on the screen, we have some dictionaries and some people walking while texting on their phones. And so in reality, we have a bigger focus on the digital space. We also have this concept of globalization, where people are migrating, immigrating, moving, speaking different languages, not having necessarily English as a first language, yet being integrated into spaces where the dominant language is not their home language. Next on the screen, we have some images of families, some growing families. So worldwide, we know the population is increasing. We also have families with large number of children in some contexts. I did a project in South Sudan in the beginning of the year, where the average size of families is 12. And so this is the reality that we face. We have people from all sorts of ages interacting in the same space, in the same time, in the same environment, using the same services and facilities. So we also have an increase in kind of spectrum of impairments. So previously, dyslexia was thought to be one condition. It's now understood that this is actually a spectrum. And so on the screen is an example of font that simulates what it would feel like to be a person who has dyslexia. And so we can now simulate what that feels like in terms of what information they can and cannot see. Similarly, we also now have font that is designed to overcome aspects of dyslexia. And so on the screen now is a font typeface called the Dyslexia font. And the shape of the letters is in such a manner that it is increasingly difficult for the brain to switch the letters around. So often with dyslexia, it's the mirror image of letters that is confusing. So letters like N and U get switched, letters like B and D get switched, P and Q. So any of those letters that kind of look similar often get switched, and then the brain can't recognize the word. And so what Dyslexia font does is it shapes the letters in a way that keeps the letters in place and helps a person recognize the pattern of a word. So these are all kind of things that are happening in this space that are considered to be universally accessible, because anyone who doesn't have dyslexia won't recognize that there's a font to assist. So just some examples of the types of things we're seeing and the types of people we're designing for. So universal design focuses on making environments, services, and products and programs accessible to all people. So this is always to the greatest extent possible. It's not that one solution is a perfect solution for everybody. It is just to be cognizant that there are so many different users in our environment, and by designing for the greatest extent possible, we can best accommodate people through inclusion. So next on the screen, I have the title that says Universal Design and Universal Access. So the difference between universal design and universal access. I often get asked that quite a bit. Universal design is essentially a toolbox, which is the image you see on the screen. So it's a set of tools It's what we do. It's defined as a verb. It's a way of designing something. So those are the tools we're going to go through in a moment, is the principles of universal design, of which there are 7. There are other tools, but for today, I'm just going to touch on those 7. Then the concept of universal access really is about the result of doing universal design. So next on the screen, you'll see a podium, a first, second, and third place, and right at the top on first place is all the people. So all the users should be winning first prize in terms of universal accessibility. So we do universal design to achieve universal accessibility. Okay, so what are some of those tools? If you look up anywhere online, the principles of universal design, there is quite a lot of information available on them. So I'm going to introduce them to you, but my purpose for today was essentially to help you remember some of them. So I'm not going to go through all the details on them. They're readily available online and they're great to use as design support tools. So if we have a look at the principles, so there are 7. Principle 1 essentially is around equitable use. So the design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. So here, for example, think WhatsApp. We have voice notes, we have voice to text, we have text to voice, and these are all being integrated into the app. We no longer have to add those as plug-ons. You might have to turn the function on in your app, but in terms of equitable use, it is useful and marketable to a diverse group of people. Principle 2 is flexibility in use. So here, if we think like the design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. So this would be exactly that example of the knife, the fish knife that I used earlier. But here, if you think about things like screen scrolling, if you think about when we first started using our phone for internet access, we could only ever scroll on the right-hand side because it had a scroll bar on one side of the screen. Now we're able to scroll by just touching the screen. So automatically that flexibility in use is now being built in. We no longer have to scroll only on one side of the screen. So the whole screen is now got that scrolling function. So that's flexibility in use. So I can scroll on that screen whether I'm left or right-handed, whether I'm using a control in my mouth or whether I'm using control with my eyes. So various functions will allow me to screen scroll now, besides, as previously there was only one function on the side, your scroll bar. So principle 3 is simple and intuitive. So this one, very important, I think, for any of the online and the digital space. So the design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. So I think there's often examples here that we can find that are horribly wrong. It's harder to find examples that are good. But if you think about simple and intuitive, SnapScan is a great example of that. Opening up the app, there's a camera icon. With a camera icon, you're scanning a barcode, and immediately all of those things are preloaded. So it's fast, it's simple, it's intuitive to use. So SnapScan is a good example in terms of principle 3. Principle 4 is your perceptible information. So this one's a bit harder to explain to people who don't have English as a first language. So perceptible information is that the design itself communicates the necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of conditions or surroundings, and the user's sensory abilities. So perceptible information, here we think about things like the icons on your phone, on the home screen, for example. So we can now customize those icons. So that's a really good function, but the perception of that information has been simplified and is really good. So your calendar icon, for example, your calculator icon, for example, your camera, your gallery. So all of these icons are now so recognizable that it's very easy to perceive the information that is behind each of those apps. So going on to principle 5. So principle 5 is probably my favorite, which is a tolerance for error. So the design minimizes hazards and adverse consequences of accidental, unintended actions. So this is essentially the Control Z function of life. So an example of this is doing any of your online payments. It's always going to ask you, are you sure you want to make this payment? Or please confirm this payment. Same with when you want to delete something out of a folder. Are you sure you want to delete this? Please confirm that you're putting this in the trash. So that is a tolerance for error that's built in to a lot of the online functionality that we see. Okay, principle 6 is a low physical effort. So the design can be used efficiently and with comfort, with no fatigue. So I often think things like banking with F&B is not a good example of a low physical effort. It takes a lot of effort to do anything through that bank. So a good example of low physical effort would potentially be the biometric functions, for example, on your phone. So previously we had to have a PIN, or you had to have a combination of some kind on the keys to unlock your phone. Low physical effort now is the biometrics that's been installed. So with that, you can access any of your banking apps, you can unlock your phone, you can access a whole bunch of your apps. So this low physical effort is a good example of how we can use those small things to overcome previous obstacles in terms of the online platforms things. So, and then principle 7 is your size and space for approach and use. So this is, I love this example of, I was at the Sevens rugby and I could read a woman's texts 2 rows in front of me because she had enlarged her screen so that she could read without her spectacles. And so size and space for approach and use is built into the functionality of our apps these days. So it just goes to show that these are things we think have been designed for a small group of people, but in fact, a wide range of users are benefiting from good design. So if we have a look at the principles in summary, I've got them listed on the screen now. So equitable use is the first one, flexibility in use is the second, simple and intuitive is the third, perceptible information is the fourth, tolerance for error, 5, low physical effort, 6, and the last one is size and space for approach and use. So I work with these principles probably every day, and I still can't tell you which one is number 1 and which one is number 5. So I wouldn't focus on the numbers. And so I'm going to show you how I best remember them and how I've also taught this to people who are not first language English speakers. So if we reduce the principles to 1 word each, so let's say we reduce the effort involved in remembering them, and each one becomes 1 word. We then get equitable, flexibility, simple, perceptible, error, effort, size, and space. So now we've already reduced the amount of information we need to remember. If we then group them according to the starting letters of each of them, it becomes equitable, error, effort. It becomes simple, size, and space. And then the 2 last stragglers are flexibility and perceptible information. So perceptible. But that is still too much for me to remember. So I've removed all the words and just kept the first letters. So now if we group them, we have 3 E's, 2 S's, an F and a P, which is a lot easier to remember than 7 whole sentences as principles. So 3 E's, 2 S's, an F and a P. Perfect. So if I had to say now 3 E's, 2 S's, an F and a P, would some of you be able to remember what some of those are standing for? So I'll show you the whole list again, not in order, but you can start seeing how it's much easier to remember the simplified letters than what it is to remember the actual whole sentences involved with each of the principles and their numbers. So what does that look like in some practices for you? This is one of the examples that I have that I use quite a lot in terms of practicing the application of the principles. And so to yourself, this is so on the screen is an image of Fly Safair's online booking app. So very easy, very simplified, very basic way of getting fast access to prices on flights. So thinking to yourself, are there any of the letters that stand out for you in terms of what you think these would be? We're not going to use the chat function. I just want you to think about this for yourself. So maybe some of the things that come to mind, I would say E for effort, as in a low physical effort. I would have the P in terms of perceptible information. It's very easy to see where departing flights are coming from, where arrival, airports. And then I would also choose an S in terms of simple. So simple and intuitive. It's a basic layout. They only want to know the basics from me. I don't need to add a whole bunch of information at this point. So this is a good example of some of the application of the principles. The principles are also it's never just one. Principles often go together. So it's often 2 or 3 principles that are predominant in some of the designs. So next on the screen is one of the accessibility functions that first came out on the iPhones, where you could enlarge your text. So it was one of the setup functions when you first got your phone. And the other screen on the slide is an example of the new Metro app. So to book for a movie, the app had initially asked you which cinema are you going to visit predominantly, and then are you a left or right-handed user? Okay, so why would they ask that? Because that is going to depend where they're going to put any of the yes functions or no functions on the screen. So very interesting to see that they were kind of using that as a criteria for somebody to log on. And so here, one of the first things in terms of the new Metro app, I would say, is the F, which is the flexibility in use, because I can tell it how I want the app to be laid out for me. In terms of the text on the iPhones, I would probably say this one is exactly that example of size and space. So size and space for approach and use. I can customize my text so that I can read it a lot easier. So these are just examples to show you what does it look like if we start applying these? How do we think about things slightly differently? And the types of functionality in terms of attention to detail that we really want to see. So this last image really is an image of a 3-dimensional brass casting of Table Mountain. So this is available at the top of Table Mountain after you get out of the cable car. It is a tactile map so that people can orientate themselves once they've arrived there. So this is great not only for kids, but for anyone with a visual impairment or people who are blind are able to orientate themselves in the space. They can see, they can feel where they are. They can feel where they are in relation to the CBD. They can feel where they are in relation to Lion's Head, Signal Hill, and all the way down to the 12 Apostles. So a great way to orientate people and beneficial to a broad range of users beyond just being a sculpture or things for kids to interact with. So very useful for some users. So I just wanted to share some of those examples with you. I'm actually, Shezwe, I think I'm not going to do terminology because I would like to give time for questions. So I'm just going to do one more slide and then I'll open up and we can have a discussion. So I think the last slide I wanted to show was I think especially for, thanks, Pete. So I think especially for people who are working in the online and digital space, I think it's very important for people to consider the principle of two senses. So this is something that has, over the last probably 4 years, become quite popular in terms of accessibility, especially in the digital space, but also actually in the built environment. And so when you're dealing with anything that is two-dimensional, you only can convey information over two senses, which is sight and hearing. We don't have the ability through digital space to give any of the other senses a chance to assist users to interact with what it is that we've designed and developed. So the challenge really is, if you are working in this space, to what extent can you accommodate two senses at any time? So if you're wanting to give anyone an option to respond to a questionnaire online, for example, are you able to accommodate both sight and sound for them to be able to navigate? So this is about saying, how is this website designed so that it integrates the use of screen readers? It's not an add-on, it's not a plug-in, it's not an overlay. This is the actual design of your service or your platform. So thinking about that from the beginning overcomes a whole range of barriers later on. And things like overlays, plugins that promise and commit to making any platform universally accessible is probably not telling you the truth. Like, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So I'd encourage you to, right from the beginning, in projects and plans, think about two senses. How do you best accommodate at least those two senses in what it is that you're designing? So I'm going to leave it there because I literally can talk forever about this stuff, but I would like to hear some questions, anything from the audience. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'd like to have a conversation with anyone who's interested.
I'm not sure of the etiquette. Are we sending questions through to Chesway, or do we talk?
Oh, sorry, you did arrive a little bit late. All we'd like to ask is, could you just introduce yourself before you start speaking, just so that it makes it a bit easier for everybody. And then you can keep your camera on now so that it'll be easier if we do have anybody who's joined who would like to see your face as well as the interpreter. Thanks.
Okay, cool. No, I was here at the beginning. It's just I wasn't sure if I needed to type in the chat or speak. That was just the confusion, but thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Sean Buch. I'm the UX practice lead at a company called Intellect. I have a question around whether design is assisting people with disabilities in gaining employment. It's actually been quite a rare thing in my own career that I've come across people with visible disabilities. Obviously, there are varying degrees of disability, but I think in my time, I've only worked with 2 people who are wheelchair bound, and I think I've come across 1 person with hearing impairment. So it's quite limited. And we are in the tech sector more broadly. So yeah, just a query about that, if technology is playing a role at all.
Thanks, Sean. So this is Colette. So I think in terms of tech, but also in terms of built infrastructure, if not designed correctly or to be accessible, actually becomes a disabling factor. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is, I think in this whole notion these days of, the work from home movement, remote working, I think a lot of people thought that they would see a lot more people with disabilities getting employed, being part of companies, engaging more. But the truth is that in order to be integrated, has got a lot to do with attitude. So it's not only your online platforms or your building, but it's around how you interact and engage with people. So having the right attitude plays a big role in getting people with disabilities to be integrated into businesses. So that's another thing. I think mainly what you're referring to is a problem of skill sets, potentially. So we still don't have a schooling system that's inclusive in South Africa. So we still have a schooling system that largely discriminates against children with disabilities. And so they don't have the same access to educational opportunities. They don't have the same access to tertiary opportunities. And therefore, we're seeing a lack in skilled people with disabilities who are entering the workforce. So it's not merely to say that, okay, you have an accessible business in terms of your built infrastructure, maybe you're inclusive in terms of attitudes and HR practices, and so everything is in place, but you're still not employing people with disabilities, is a potential lack of skill sets that's coming through. So it totally depends on the industries, but it's multifactorial. And so it's not only skills, it's attitudes, it's access to environments and platforms. So it's a complex network in terms of getting to employ people with disabilities. So I work mainly in the built environment. So I work mainly with infrastructure and transport systems. So in that space, I can relate to the question because I always get asked, oh, why do we need to build these ramps if I don't see people with disabilities using them? And so it's always a chicken and egg scenario. People are not there because they can't access it. And that's why you're not going to see them. So if you don't put it in place, they're never going to come. So it's also a bit, it kind of goes both ways. But so in terms of working with people with disabilities, I think it's not as easy as it seems. There's also, South Africa's got a big culture of, what do they call them, like incentives. So there's a lot of people who give incentives to people with disabilities to work for a certain period of time so they can count them as part of the BE system. And after that, they just move on to another, so like internships. So people hop from internship to internship without any prospect of long-term employment because people don't invest in retaining people with disabilities in companies. So it's complex. It's not such a simple answer, but we do need to see more of that. And I do think we will eventually get to the point where schools are integrating children with disabilities. And that's a fundamental first step. If children stop seeing the difference between those who have disabilities and those who don't have disabilities, our society will become more inclusive as they all grow up. So, yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, it's just Sean again. If you wouldn't mind if I just extend on the question, if we think of it from a school level, which makes a lot of sense, then, I mean, South Africa's at a deficit for school environments more generally, textbooks, teachers, etc. So it would probably be a further stretch to try integrate technologies or methods into the classroom that might make it easier for those with disabilities to integrate. But are there any sort of positive trends globally where children are being better integrated into schooling with screen readers, maybe some sort of active translations for hearing impaired people? I'm just not sure if there's anything happening there.
So South Africa has, so this is Colette. South Africa has a very progressive integrated education policy from years back. I think it's as far back as 2006 or 2008. And so I think the problem South Africa has is the implementation of policies. We have a lot of great policies, but it's the actual implementation thereof that is a problem. So just to touch on the education side, South Africa has that complex problem where we're not only looking at accessibility on its own as something that needs to be added, but we have a whole range of people needs that needs to be addressed. So things like housing, sanitary, sanitation, water, access to education, all of those are primary needs that South Africa is still struggling to meet. The problem comes in when we think that accessibility is different to all of those basic needs. If our inclusive housing policy included housing for people with disabilities, it would have no impact on costs, but a large impact on people's integration in society. It's the same with schooling. As long as we are still rolling out schools and education programs, it's not an added feature for teachers to be able to accommodate the majority of children who have disabilities. It is just about having a school that enables access. You're always going to have kids who have different requirements. So whether that's an interpreter or an assistant or some support at the school or additional learning time or additional exam writing time. So you're always going to have that. That's not specifically for children who are classified as children with disabilities. So it's not, accessibility is always seen as an add-on, whereas if it's integrated from the beginning, that's how it starts making a difference. So it shouldn't be seen as separate. And I think this is currently what South Africans are still doing. We're seeing it as an add-on. We're seeing it as an add-on to housing. We're seeing it as, let's first give everyone water and then let's make taps in rural areas accessible to people with disabilities. It shouldn't be like that. If we're putting in the infrastructure, that should be accessible from the beginning. So it's that fundamental thinking in terms of spatial planning, education, integration. Those are the big, small changes that are going to have a big impact going forward. So what South Africa is doing right is we have, so I'd mentioned we'd signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We signed that in 2007, as soon as any country could sign. We signed and ratified, which said we would report on this every 4 years and we would make changes to advocate and implement the rights of persons with disabilities. Only this year, in 2022, was there research done on writing a policy or a new act in terms of people with disabilities. And that is what's happened in various other countries to drive the rights of persons with disabilities. So I think South Africa will still see a whole modification in terms of laws and policies going forward. We'd recently, probably about 2 months ago, seen the Copyright Act being thrown out of court because it didn't accommodate people with visual impairments. So these things are happening. There are changes that are taking place, albeit a little bit slow, but there is change coming. And I think the change will just start escalating as policies and all of these things start changing faster and faster. So that's a bit of a mission that the Human Rights Commission is on at the moment, to start driving change in policies to be inclusive of aspects regarding people with disabilities. So we learned that from international practices. So sorry, that's why I'm referring to that. So we'd learned the Disability Act was something that we'd seen from international practice. And so the Law Reform Commission would be wanting to execute something similar here over the long term. Okay, Sonic, I see a hand from you.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. My name's Sonic Tendai. I'm a graphic designer. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to ask probably 2 questions or contributions. Okay, what's the difference for the blind when, because I've noticed there are books where they use Braille, right? And for their images, they sometimes make use of Braille. So what's the difference with using the Braille and is it embossing? Would they understand?
Very good question. So this is Colette. So thanks, Sonic. So there are 2 types of users. So you have people with visual impairments who can read Braille. So people who have visual impairments and are blind can read Braille. But Braille is essentially like a language. So there are different types of Braille. There's contracted Braille for people who are very familiar with reading Braille. So it's like shorthand writing, essentially, in Braille. And then there is kind of standard Braille that spells out every letter. Not everyone who has a visual impairment or is blind can read Braille. And so similar to people who have hearing impairments or people who are deaf, not everybody understands or can speak sign language. So it's the same kind of concept. But in signage, where we have embossed signage, we are asking people to recognize letters. And so not all people who read Braille can read letters as English letters or, you know, like in terms of grammar. But not all people who read grammar in terms of texture can read Braille. So that's why we often have both. So we have the embossed, so it's letters and words or pictures that are raised from the base. So the embossed reading would enable people to interpret an image, for example, which is different from the translation in English to Braille. So it's essentially a different language. So if you're embossing, it's best to have an image embossed. You can have text embossed, but then it is recommended that you have the Braille underneath as well. So two different users, it's essentially like reading two different languages.
Okay, thank you. So why I was asking this is there's a time when I wanted to do a project where, like you're talking about inclusivity, where a book, someone who's visually impaired and arthro-sighted could be accommodated in both. But what I realized is doing such projects, there's no support. Like if you want to start doing that, there's so many roadblocks. People don't really want to support that. So no wonder why people now end up doing books, because I came up with a book which encompasses both Braille and so the top part had Braille and the other part had more stuff. But I didn't manage to talk with the visual impaired individual. So from there on, I didn't know what to go from there because there's no such of like support system to say. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Does anyone else have another question?
Yes. Hi, guys. It's Ranesh speaking. So I'd just like to come in on the two previous questions, if I may. I want to start off firstly with the one with the, so first to give you a bit of background. I am, for practical purposes, blind for this discussion. So when it comes to that book and Braille and contracted and uncontracted Braille, it's like Colette said, not everybody can speak it, can read it, and for even those who can, the contractions and that can get a bit confusing in shorthand. So again, there are organizations and who can connect you to volunteers and people to assist, but as you mentioned, they are hard to find and hard to come by. With regarding to the teaching and inclusivity, I think there's 2 points that have been missed that are very important to raise. The first being, it's actually really expensive to cope with a lot of these disabilities and the infrastructure and that needs to be put in place, which means there's a lot of funding that needs to go into both at the individual level of the student and where necessary for the school, or at the collective level, i.e. school, districts, and so forth. Which brings into consideration a whole nother level of issues in terms of distribution to get material and so forth to students. I myself went to a visually impaired school, which had to eventually set up their own printing press on site just to make sure that students had the stuff they needed when they needed it. Then regarding the teaching and education, yes, support in that is still needed. And I know I was involved in a project with one of the universities where a few years ago, I think like 2018 or 19, or just before COVID, they were finally putting together an inclusive teaching textbook for honors level teachers. And it is very much a matter of chicken and egg, where do we build the environment and hope the students and things are able to attend? And do we actually build up the students, both as was mentioned at the school level and at the education and workplace level? Because even as a working professional, I find there's a lot of, they may have some attitudes where they wish, they wish to encourage people with disabilities. But if you look at the actual systems and environments, it says a very different story. Those are just my few thoughts for the matter. And just thank you to Colette and Cheswe for putting the session together.
Thanks so much, Ranesh. That's a very valuable contribution. Thank you very much. I think the focus on HR, everyone says they're ready to employ people with disabilities, but the HR policies themselves and how people are actually employing people with disabilities isn't accessible. So, you know, applications go out and say, yes, we welcome people with disabilities to come and apply for the job. And you're only required to climb 2 stairs to enter reception. You know, for example, it's everyone seems to be open to employing people with disabilities, but the systems in place are not accessible. And I think a lot of times people don't actually know what that means. So it comes back to the understanding of what disability actually is. And I think part of that problem is our international symbol of access, which is a picture of a person who uses a wheelchair. And so I think when people think mostly people with disabilities, they think the visible disabilities. So what is it that I can see, that I can categorize this person according to? And that's not the way to start employing people with disabilities or to open up that discussion for inclusion. So the definition is broad, and in fact, I'll just wait for Pete to join. Okay. So the definition of people with disabilities is broad. And in fact, if you look at the difference between an impairment and a disability, disability is imposed by society. It is not actually the condition of the person, but the understanding of that, especially in the employment sector, is not very clear. And so disability is imposed by society. It's a construct that we've seen happen because we've not accommodated people with different impairments and different ways of working and being. So, yeah, just wanted to add that. I think there is another question.
Before the question, I think part of the reason why companies always look for that whole distinction when it comes to HR is when they look at impairments, they look at the definition of 6-month medical condition, not the impact to ability to live a normal life.
Yeah.
Which is the second statement in that definition. And just using the first one means basically anything goes. And because the law also says reasonable accommodation, it doesn't say what reasonable is.
Yeah.
And costs come into factor there. And let's be honest, most places, don't want to spend more than they have to get the productivity that they need to.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have 2 questions which may contradict each other. I just want to get your thoughts on this. Do you think the rapid advancement of technology is running the risk of leaving certain people behind? And on the flip side of that is that won't the constant accounting for everybody hamper progress of certain technologies?
Can I ask you just to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I am Dingole. I am going to be working for a company called Explore AI.
Great. Thanks so much, Dingole. So this is Colette. So I think any advancement that is happening has to include different aspects for different people, or it would be leaving a large percentage of people behind. So it has to accommodate different users. And I think the awareness of that is becoming more, especially in the online space. The reason online is probably easier to impact in terms of accessibility is because it's got a faster turnaround time. So the lifespan of concrete is about 100 years. The lifespan of a website can be a couple of days. So the ability to impact change in the digital space and online platforms is a lot faster, it's a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper, definitely, to impact change in terms of the technology. And technology has to accommodate the various groups of users, because otherwise it would be leaving the very people it was designing for behind. So the whole concept of universal design says, I'm designing for my future self, because should all of us be lucky enough to one day become a person who is older, an elderly person, we would be the beneficiaries of the design we're putting in place today. So it's important that we do integrate that, because with the increase in medical conditions, increasing lifespan, like increasing age populations, all of those factors are contributing to people using online technologies, assistive platforms and services for an extended period of time. So if we don't design for accessibly now, we're designing ourselves out of the system in a couple of years' time. So it is important that that happens. I'm trying to think of the second part of your question.
And I go for the second part, Colette.
Yeah, please.
It's Ranesh. So, whilst technology, my personal experience, is some of the newer technology is leaving people with disabilities behind, despite the point that you made, and that's very well articulated and necessary, and we need to be designing inclusively. So your second part of your question was around innovation. If we design inclusively, we want to be hampering innovation. So the correct answer to this is, actually, if we design inclusively, we are advancing innovation tremendously. Boston Dynamics, the biggest robotics organization in the world, most famous, doing a lot of awesome things, started off in DARPA, designing things for handicaps for the vets and for the military to support them in long distance journeys, which eventually led into prosthetics and is now in robotics. If you look at most of your AI assistants, I'm not going to name any of them, I'm sure you all know them. A lot of the stuff started out partly with screen readers to give the voice component, and speech input for those who don't have physical abilities to input keyboard and mice. They combined those and they've got the digital assistant and the smart home speakers and so forth. A lot of the technologies we have is actually comes from these sectors. Even the cybersecurity industry and typing can be traced back to building inclusivity for people with disabilities and different needs. If anything, it will actually spur innovation on if the people, as Colette pointed out, have the interest to design for their future selves and to design inclusively.
Great. Thanks, Dinesh. Bingol has given you a little heart sign on the on your status. I see Liesel. Would you like to come in?
Yes, it's Liesel here. My background is in information technology. I have interest in human-computer interaction, and I haven't worked practically with this, but I'm always trying to learn more about the area. my thing, or what always concerns me, is that we speak about accessibility, universal designs, and these groups that need attention, not getting attention, and not looked after as they should. I believe that we need to hear the voices. We need to hear their voices. We need to hear the inputs, and we need them to evaluate what is being designed for them. I'm also aware that if you come from a background where you have not been impacted in as these users you are designing for are impacted, it's difficult to get into those user groups or to collaborate with them. Now, if you want to look at the participatory design approach, how would you suggest, or what approach do you use to get these users involved in being part of a universal design project? Or because it's not easy to get access to them, and it's also not easy to get to a point where you can sit down and have a conversation with them. So I'm interested in learning, how do you approach them, how do you get them involved, and how do you get to work alongside them without them feeling resistant to do so, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's my question.
Thanks, Liesl. So this is Colette, just in response to that. So a couple of points that you raised. So I myself, like you mentioned, I am not a person with a disability, and I often get asked, when people see me come in as an access consultant, oh, you're not a person with a disability, how come you work as an access consultant? And I think the point is that you are never going to find a person who has all the disabilities to be able to consult holistically. So it is like saying, if I have someone who's a wheelchair user, that they then can't speak to design for people who are blind. So it doesn't actually matter whether or not I myself am a person with a disability, because I consult with large groups of stakeholders. So how do I do that? I have, over the years, established networks of groups, of organizations of and for people with disabilities. So when I work with an organization, I establish a stakeholder group. So this is often called a universal access forum, or a stakeholder grouping of users. And so what that allows people to do is to have access to groups of people who have experience in specific disabilities. So I can never speak in terms of experience for people with disabilities. I can only connect people to people who have experience in disability. So I think the disability sector is a bit of a secret club. Like I think somebody else had mentioned around getting the book and Braille and embossing, and it's difficult to find service providers in there. I think once you start working in that space, you start meeting new people, you start meeting organizations that offer services, and so a network starts growing. But it's only by starting to investigate that will you grow and establish a network in this space. So there isn't a list of people that one can just contact and freely get access to information on. It's about establishing relationships. It's around working together to solve problems. It's giving input, receiving input, making sure people are heard in the feedback that they give. And so how does one start that? You just start. Connect with people. It depends where you are and which countries. There's a lot of NGOs where people can go and do some volunteer work. You can, give back to that community in terms of, in exchange really for learning a bit about them, seeing how they work. What is it that the organization is doing? What services do they do? So it's always a two-way street. And so I think often the clients I have expect people with disabilities to give their expertise on their disability experience for free. And if you are working as a consultant, you get paid for that service. And so it should also be a fair exchange. If you're expecting information from an expert in a specific disability field, that's an exchange of services. And so there should be some form of remuneration for that. So it's not that difficult to get into the space. And once you start investigating and meeting people, it kind of opens up a whole different sector of learning and networks that you probably won't even know that they exist. So my recommendation is just to go and see some organizations, go and start speaking to people. I think often people who don't have interactions with people with disabilities are afraid. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid to make statements, or they're afraid to ask questions. We fear the things we don't know. So if you're not familiar with people with disabilities or have any experience in that field, we tend to avoid it because we don't want to make mistakes. But the best advice I can give in terms of getting into this sector is just to start. So start these conversations. If you offend someone, they're going to tell you. You won't make the mistake again. So I suggest you just reach out. I mean, I started volunteering in the NGO sector when I first started working in industry, and that was many, many years ago now already. So, and it's always about keeping those connections alive, constantly communicating. How are things going? What is happening in your NGOs? What offerings do you have that we can potentially, leverage or work on together? So, yeah, it's like any relationships. It takes a bit of effort to get in and to maintain.
Can I just say two things here? One,
Ranesh, come in, please.
Yes. Could I join your network afterwards? So perhaps could we just have a side chat at the end? And secondly, the other thing is to Liesel. Firstly, congratulations on taking your first step by attending a conversation like this. And secondly, the sad reality is people with disabilities, and I'm talking across disabilities, are not very mobile in our country or throughout the African continent and most of the world. It is very hard to get around. And that does mean you're going to have to go out to them. And a lot of patience and open-mindedness is necessary, because talking again as a person with a visual disability, you can enter a room and you'll find sometimes you're just ignored because you're not able to participate and read the social cues or have eye contact. And that's another stereotype that also needs to be addressed when you wanted to go and gather the, for lack of a better phrase, stay out of your ivory tower and humbling yourself to the disability. Because sometimes, if you, for example, dealing with somebody with cerebral palsy, they may have poor speech patterns compared to what you're used to or what's been demonstrated in this talk. And it requires an additional level of patience to work with them to also deal with their frustration, not just in communicating with you, but also trying to communicate their own ideas within themselves. And those are where the two major barriers are to actually getting these people involved. Because in my case, as a person with a visual disability, I'm not reading the notices that are always posted out. I don't even know where to look for them if somebody like you is looking for an expert like me. Because in addition to being visually impaired, I'm also a computer scientist and have worked basically throughout the entire IT industry. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that sometimes dealing with stakeholders, you just get dismissed straight out because you're not the right type of person, even if you have the skills and the capabilities that are they looking for. Sorry.
Thanks, Rainesh, for that contribution. I see Peter has got a hand up.
Hi everyone, my name is Peter. My current background is in the built environment as an architectural designer, and I'm busy transitioning into the digital design realm. Just a bit of a perspective from the built environment. Colette, I absolutely agree with you in the fact that South Africa is very good at making the policies, but implementation is absolutely lacking. And therein lies a bit of a problem. I can't tell you how often I've been into existing buildings. There is a policy that, once an existing building is being altered or changed, that it must comply with the current rules and regulations, and, things like paraplegic bathroom stuff now has to be included. However, I can't tell you how many buildings I've walked into where they say, yeah, but we have one, and you walk in there and you can't even get a wheelchair in there.
Yeah.
Or that according to the specification, the layout has to be a certain way, but then you walk in there and the layout does not accommodate it. For example, they've put the toilet in the middle. So where would you put a wheelchair, as a simple example, to try and scoot over onto the toilet? Just as a simple example. So it's, I think from a designer's perspective, it's an absolute lack of understanding of exactly what the requirements are. Like you said, it's much more diverse than just looking at wheelchair access or access for visually impaired, or even access or assistance for someone that can't hear or can't understand, or maybe can't read a sign for other reasons. Designers, I don't think we understand that. We've never engaged that. We've never had forums or platforms where we were able to learn more of the skills and the tools, like you say, to be able to design for that and address those needs. So it is then done as an afterthought, okay, fine, we're required to put in a wheelchair bathroom. So let's put it there on the first floor in the back, but there's no lift in the building. Yeah. So it's an absolute lack of understanding, and opening up the conversation is definitely a very good first step to try and drive it forward.
Yeah, definitely, Peter. I couldn't agree more. I think if we understood the why some of those technical requirements are so important, we would be more inclined to adhere to technical requirements. I think people don't understand why an accessible bathroom has got to be a specific size, or why signage needs to be a certain size, or why color contrast is important. And as soon as we can start understanding that, and understanding that people are different, then I think people might be more inclined to, implement some of the basic standards that are available. But 100% speak the truth. So thanks so much.
No problem.
Chizwe, anything from your side?
No, I'm not sure if anybody's got more questions. Are there no further questions? Looks like not. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It was Peter who just comes from built environments. And just to tell you a little joke, Peter. I think you might appreciate this. I was working at a company, I'm not going to mention their name. They went ahead and got a consultant to tell them that a long drop style toilet design is suitable for the accessible bathroom. So, conversation aside, I think in some cases like that, common sense is just as important.
Yes, absolutely.
But Rainesh, common sense is not as common as we'd like it to be.
If it was as common, it wouldn't be called common sense, right? Sorry, Chase, we go ahead.
No. Well, if there's no further questions, or I mean, we can also just stop the recording and continue the conversation if anybody would like to stay on. But yeah, I'd like to, before we formally close off, I'd just like to thank Pete and Bernice for helping us out with sign language, South African Sign Language interpretation. It's really been a different experience for us, and thank you so much. And thank you very much, Colette, for sharing information with us. I think I've been looking for a consultant like you for a while to share this info with us. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining and for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to stop the recording now.